Welcome, everyone, to the Herbert C. Kellman Seminar on International Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And before I get started, we get started with introducing the speaker, I'd like to just let you know that we've turned off the chat feature to allow our community, people watching, to focus on our speaker's presentation. And we love knowing about you, where you're from, and we want to stay connected. So we've developed some polls to learn more about you, and we want, and we'll share the answers with you too. So the first poll, it's coming. It's about your professional experience. What best describes your interest, negotiation, mediation, or conflict resolution? Okay, so we have 13% faculty research, 8% negotiation practitioners, 20% negotiation practitioners in the corporate field, 25% negotiation practitioners in the nonprofit. Someone just says, I really think negotiation is cool and I love learning more. So that's the end of the first poll. The second poll it's about the region you're from, where you're from. Which region are you connecting from? Africa, Asia, Pacific, Australia, Europe, Middle East, North America, South America, Central America, or other? Okay, so 2% from Africa, Asia, Pacific, Australia, 9%, Europe, 31, Middle East, 1, North America, 54, South and Central America, 2%, and other, 1%. So thank you for that. And the final question, poll question, is about past attendance here at the Kellman Seminar. Have you attended a Kellman Seminar or PON live event in the past? So if you could just respond to what's appropriate to you. So 6% said you never miss one. 35% say whenever my schedule allows. 23% says whenever the topic interests me. 33% say this is my first event. And 2% others. So, well, this is just wonderful, and I hope you all continue to tune in to this Kellman Seminar series. And by the way, it is co-sponsored by the Program on Negotiation and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs here at Harvard. And before I introduce our delightful speaker, I'd like to just let you know that the seminar is being recorded. So if you'd like to hear it again or tell a friend, what you can do is go on the Program on Negotiation website, click on events, and in a couple of days, you'll see the seminar there, the Herbert C. Kellman Seminar. And the format, what's going to happen here, we have an hour. So the first 40 minutes, 35 to 40 minutes, our speaker will be giving her presentation, after which we'll have a Q&A. And put your questions in the Q&A function. And I want to apologize at the outset because we hardly ever get to the entirety through all of the questions. So I will now introduce our wonderful speaker, Professor Diana Chigas. By the way, we go back like 30 years, and I always say that we kind of grew up together here, Diana and I, in this field of international conflict resolution at Harvard. So, Diana, it's wonderful to have you here with us. She's going to be, her title of her talk is No Peace Without Tackling Corruption, Why Peacebuilders Should Be Thinking About Corruption. And let me just read Diana's bio. She has such an incredible background. She's done so many really remarkable interventions throughout her career. As I said, she's a professor of practice of international negotiation and conflict resolution at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And she's the co-director of the Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy program, where she leads the work on corruption and conflict and the intersectional dimensions of social norms that drive corruption. Before joining that program, Diana co-led the Reflecting on Peace Practice program at CDA Collaborative Learning Projects, where she worked with governmental, non-governmental organizations both on systemic conflict analysis, strategic planning, reflection, and evaluation to improve the impact of peace programming and conflict sensitivity of humanitarian and development assistance. She has over 30 years of experience as a facilitator and advisor in negotiation and conflict resolution, including working with the OSCE, the UN, OAS on strategies, training, and advice on preventive diplomacy, and tackling interethnic dialogue in Cyprus and track 2 discussions in El Salvador, South Africa, Ecuador, Peru, and Georgia, South Ossetia peace processes. So she has made significant contributions to our field. And Diana, we're just thrilled to have you here and can't wait to hear about your research on corruption in conflict and the importance that information could, sharing that with the Peacebuilders community is really critically important. So thank you for everything you do. It's turning it over to you.
Great. I'm going to see if I can actually share my screen. Hopefully it is sharing correctly. Hi, everybody. And Donna, thank you so much for inviting me. We do go way back and have sort of really grown up in this field together. And I'd also thank PON, which I also go way back with, and the Weatherhead Center. And I'm just really pleased to be with a group. I've been watching where you're from, et cetera, with just the breadth and depth of experience. So I'm looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. Start with just saying how I started as a facilitator, advisor, trainer in negotiation and conflict resolution. Worked with Roger Fisher, worked with a number of you who are or listening today, and ended up I've been working on corruption for about 8 years. And the first places I worked with Roger were in South Africa and El Salvador. And this was in the 90s, and they were considered, it was very exciting, sort of big successes in peace negotiations, and still are considered big successes. But over the last 30 years, they haven't progressed to the more just and sustainable peace that I think many of us and many people in the countries had hoped for. In South Africa, the Zondo Commission report really shined light on the extent to which corruption has penetrated the state, to which the state was captured by the Gupta family during the Zuma administration, and then the impacts on people, on infrastructure, on livelihoods, on violence, and the amounts of violence that have still plagued a number of these societies. So as I looked at that, and I'm now working back in South Africa on corruption, I started to think, well, is there a connection here? Is there something that we could do to sort of have it not go down that path? The same time as co-director of the Reflecting on Peace Practice program, especially, I've facilitated a lot of conflict analyses. And in so many of them, people systematically, regularly identified some form of corruption as a key driver of conflict. It may be different, but it was noticeable. And I started looking around saying, are we as a field dealing with corruption? And I saw very few people thinking about or addressing this aspect. So that drew me to work starting in about 2016 to work more on corruption with my co-director at the Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy program, Cheyenne Charbatke Church, whom some of you may know, also from the peacebuilding field. And we're trying to understand better what the connection is between corruption and conflict, and more importantly, work on how effectively to do anti-corruption work in these contexts and build bridges between anti-corruption and peacebuilding fields to develop practical ways that we can work together and be more effective. So before I sort of launch into things, I just want to say a couple of things about what we mean by corruption. And I promise not to go into definitional debates because we would be here for the entire day. But it's important to understand a bit how we understand corruption in order to understand the connections with conflict and peace building. And so when I did too, when I entered this field, but when we usually think about corruption, we usually think about individual acts, sort of the bad apple, the greedy person who engages in deviant behavior, violates the rules. They find an opportunity because there are gaps in the system. There's not enough oversight. They think they can get away with it. And they do it for their own personal gain, mostly financial. And so a classic sort of example and image would be a sort of a bribery scenario. And this isn't how corruption works in many parts of the world, and particularly in a lot of conflict-affected contexts, at least some of the ones that I have been working in. And in those contexts, we're really talking about corruption that's endemic or systemic. And it's not just that it's widespread, which is usually the case, but it's really a team effort in the sense that it's embedded in and perpetrated by networks. It's a cooperative venture. It's organized, it's institutionalized. So it's not just a one-off transaction, a deviation, but it's regular with informal rules of the game about what people are supposed to do or how they behave in order to acquire illicit wealth and power and distribute it. And like many systems, and for those who are familiar with systems analysis, this should be familiar, it has a purpose, a rationale. So it's not just about individual self-interest. It goes beyond that, a social, political, economic purpose beyond the individual's self-interest. And sometimes that could be a socially legitimate one, like survival. People who engage in Uganda, when I was doing work in Uganda, people would bribe prison officials to get their loved ones out because they feared that they were going to die because the conditions were so bad. In some cases, it's not so socially beneficial, using corruption to retain elite power. I like the way an Afghan official is reported to have described it this way to a US embassy official some years ago. I think it captures it nicely. He said, corruption is not just a problem for the system of governance in Afghanistan, it is the system of governance. So you can start to see how and why this is relevant to conflict, because in these contexts, it's very much a key feature of the political, economic, social economy. And it's highly resilient and adaptive. And so you can't just excise it by deal with it by arresting, making high, profile arrests, putting people in jail, et cetera. You need to deal with it in a deeper way. I think just one more point about corruption. It's one word that describes a pretty wide range of practices by very different actors at different levels and sectors, from large-scale embezzlement or kickbacks in procurement to political interference in judicial processes to nepotism in hiring to parents paying teachers to get good grades for their kids to sextortion or sex for job advancement, et cetera. It's a pretty wide range. And using just one word, corruption, makes it sound like they're all the same thing. And of course, they do share some characteristics. They're all abuses of entrusted power for private gain, which is the sort of de facto widely accepted definition that's used in the international development assistance community, at least. But beyond that, they're different. They have different causes, impacts, different relevance to conflict and peace dynamics. And of course, they're not addressable with the same instruments. So I'm going to use corruption, the word corruption in the interest of time, but I think it's really important to understand that if we really need to understand and address it as part of conflict dynamics, we need to be much more specific about what we're talking about when we say corruption. So with that said, why do I think peace building needs to be thinking about corruption and that peace isn't sustainable if we don't deal with corruption in these contexts where corruption is endemic? So I want to say something about why I think corruption is a conflict issue. And the first thing is that it is very much a divider. It's something that worsens divisions and root causes of conflict in a number of ways. And here's the beginnings of a list of one. I will spend a little bit of time on three. But it is something that's very much, sometimes a grievance causes grievances itself, but reinforces so many other conflict dynamics. and I'll talk about three. One about exacerbating inequalities and grievances that drive conflict. And I'll tell a story from some research that we did in Central African Republic a few years ago that embodies a bit how it can do that. And it's not just the big scandal type of corruption that we hear about in the news, like Operation Car Wash in Brazil. Here we're talking even about everyday kinds of interactions where corruption is at play. So we were doing research on the drivers of corruption in the criminal justice system in Central African Republic in 2017. And in talking to officials within the court system, judges, clerks, lawyers, et cetera, and they were mostly Christians. There's a Christian-Muslim divide. It's not the only divide in Central African Republic, but it's one. So they dominate the criminal justice system in terms of officials. And so they explained to us that Muslims are corrupt. They give gifts. They cultivate relationships with public officials to smooth the path for their business and to escape justice. And they are the ones who are responsible for the state of the justice system today and for the lack of rule of law and chaos. So you talk to Muslims who were the ones mostly interacting with the justice system by contrast, and they were complaining, well, the justice system is corrupt with everybody, but they were systematically charged more than Christians for corrupt transactions, at least they believed that, and they were treated more harshly if they were arrested or caught up in judicial processes. So they felt they had to do whatever they could to avoid the criminal justice system, and that included paying bribes so that they could get out because it's so discriminatory and a tool of oppression against Muslims. So just those different perspectives give you a real window into how corrupt practices and the perceptions that emerge around them can drive intergroup grievances and distrust. And so in here you also had both the sort of inequalities, you had grievances about unequal treatment and deepening negative stereotypes. So often it's the powerful, it's often the party in government extracting from the population that is a cause, either by accumulating money illicitly for the benefit of their group or network, or they distribute resources like jobs, contracts to their people and not to the other people. And so this not only entrenches actual inequality and exclusion, but when this overlaps with salient group identities, it can really be explosive and drive people to armed groups. I'll say a last thing on the grievances. It's actually not necessarily the corruption itself that causes grievances, though it also does. But it really is that sense of injustice and resentment that the other side is getting an unfair advantage in a difficult world. So a second way that's probably not surprising, I would think, to many of you, is that corruption also undermines the legitimacy and capacity of the state, both in terms of their actual ability to deliver services. If you siphon off money, if you hire your own people nepotistically, and they're not competent to get things done, things don't get done, and grievances don't get managed. So both the capacity, but also the legitimacy, the degree to which the state is trusted and seen as legitimate, and people want to follow and be loyal to the state, and especially if the government is really seen as being extractive of its own citizens. So in Mali, for example, the Forest Service regularly extorts, quote unquote, fees for licenses for land use for pastoralists. They arbitrarily impose fines on women foraging for wood. They imprison people until they can bribe their way out. They would delay resolving land use conflicts, and land use conflicts was a key area for conflict in that part of Mali. So they would collect bribes repeatedly to not resolve things so that they could then eventually make more money. So the biggest impact of this kind of practice, and was in Mali here, was on the pastoralists who were already marginalized, mostly from Fulani tribe. And in a place where land use conflict is a source of grievance and a cause of violence, and so important to livelihoods, this has been a key reason they have found why Fulani have increasingly joined jihadist groups. So the legitimacy capacity, it may not be a direct a direct cause of conflict in that sense, but it certainly lays a foundation for a lot of grievance and appeal of armed groups. And then finally, I probably am stating the obvious, but corruption and its connection to illicit, say, criminal activity is also a significant source of funds to wage conflict, war, especially for non-state armed groups, but also for the government. It's hard to imagine, for example, the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, being able to survive and engage in the war or wars in Myanmar without the funds they have generated through illicit mining, through smuggling and collection of taxes from jade, ethnic arms groups too. And the profits also then create incentives and stakes in continuing the conflicts. And so that also makes mediation and negotiation and conflict resolution much more difficult because there are now vested interests. And just say a final thing here, because I think corruption, because of it's a very morally laden term. It's associated with decay, immorality, evil, injustice. It gives it a lot of kind of purchase and importance in conflict. Sometimes it's actually hard to tell whether something is actually caused by corruption, whether it's just maladministration, general dysfunction or inefficiency, incompetence, or the product of an unfair, structurally unfair system. From many people's perspective, all of this is seen as corrupt, and it's often labeled corrupt. And that makes it easier for political entrepreneurs or violent groups to mobilize people by labeling them corrupt. And I think we've seen that happening disturbingly a lot recently in our own country. It's easy to generate, the easiest way to generate anger is to accuse people of corruption. And insurgents, politicians capitalize on that too by accusing of corruption, labeling somebody as evil, and presenting themselves as the alternative and the better solution. And so it's a way of really bringing in, mobilizing, and escalating emotions in conflict. I'd say it's a bit of a vicious cycle because the relationship goes the other way too. So corruption not only drives conflict, but conflict is a driver also an enabler of corruption. I mean, in other words, corruption is part of the post-settlement landscapes because conflict weakens state institutions, it weakens social cohesion, it weakens community structures, it undermines or changes traditional leadership, it brings new actors to the fore, opens up a lot of opportunities for corruption and illicit activities. Syria, for example, has become a hub for producing and trafficking the drug Captagon as the civil war devastated the formal economy. In Mali, organized crime groups across the Sahel use the income generated by their illicit activities to infiltrate state structures. Through financing elections and politicians. They have so they generate vested interests and stakes in the government. So it's not just there. But the point is that these things are part of the landscape and they're hard to dismantle without an explicit effort. Political leaders become beholden to some of these criminal groups, become beholden to these financiers and these activities, and will undermine efforts to sort of undo them and to build institutions that can move forward. Guatemala is a great example there. That post-Civil War, the government, the military, and criminal groups developed alliances that really generated a lot of violence, in fact, and were uncovered. We only know that because the Commission Against Impunity, in fact, uncovered a lot of that and the extent to which all of this had permeated the state and generated both high levels of corruption and exclusion, but also violence. So it's something one needs to deal with. So if it's a driver of conflict, and if corruption is part of the post-conflict landscape that one should be taking into account, why do we rarely deal with it? And anti-corruption does appear directly or sometimes indirectly in peace agreements, and a number of them. And so it's not that it's completely ignored. And we don't have a lot of information on sort of how serious it is and what some of these conversations and the follow-up. I think that's a gap in our research. But there are many times when it's often rhetoric and it's not followed up on, including by sort of support to peace processes. So the OECD in 2022 did a study looking at post-conflict reconstruction and peace building assistance and looking sort of how much of that goes to anti-corruption. And so they found only 6% of donor funds were allocated for anti-corruption. You might say, well, 6%, that's not so bad, given the sort of scale of needs in these environments. But if you consider that this includes assistance to judicial and police reform, as well as legislative and political party functions, in addition to direct anti-corruption, it's pretty small. And so why? And what's the impact? And this is really, I think, the crux of why I'm really interested in this question. It's because the challenge is that the assumption in the field, in our field, in the peace building field, is that there's a trade-off. You either have peace or you pursue good governance focus. You can't do both at the same time. And so lots of mediators, people in the peace building activities in the immediate post-conflict period often choose to ignore corruption. It's not like they don't know it's happening. But they choose to ignore it because they fear that if they try to address it, it could upset a delicate and vulnerable peace settlement. And there, of course, there is truth to that. There is evidence that corruption can stabilize conflict, at least in the short term, when the quote unquote rents, and we're talking things like patronage, control of ministries and access to resources, contracts, et cetera, when they're distributed across conflict lines, they can promote some stability. This kind of patronage redistributes resources and can be a mechanism for ensuring that key groups buy into the peace agreement. Not a great way to govern, to promote development, to promote rule of law, et cetera, but it can help to prevent an outbreak or post-agreement of return to violent conflict. So the theory then is stabilize now, and when we're stable, then we can deal with corruption later and promote more good governance and et cetera later. And there are several problems with this logic. One is, how sustainable is it? Once the global economy changes, if the resources change, in a place like South Sudan, if oil prices changes and the size of the pie, of the pot changes, it can fall apart pretty easily if some scarcity is created. But equally important, I think it drives the continuation of violence in a different form. So the violent conflict has been, quote unquote, settled, but then violence morphs into criminal violence, one-sided violence by the government actors to protect their interests. And this was certainly true in Guatemala. With the police, military, and criminal groups, they continued to subject the population to very high levels of violence, both from the government and repression from the government, but also the drug cartels. And I think even the Commission on Impunity, I think they were surprised to the extent to which that had really engaged so much of the state. So the other problem, which I think is a problem for us as a field, is that, and we're finding that the corruption, if you wait for a while, it becomes so entrenched that it becomes hard to deal with later. So it may be too late to deal with it later. And so as a result, it may lock places into negative peace, which we're talking absence of violence, and stymie progress to a much more just and sustainable or positive peace, where you can address some of the root causes of conflict, you can build attitudes, institutions, structures that sustain a peaceful society. And I think many of us hope that you start with a negative peace and then expand and build in some of the structure for positive peace, but corruption can be a real blocker. Bosnia, for me, I spent time in Kosovo, and I think it's true in Kosovo as well, but Bosnia has a power sharing, sort of ethnic power sharing agreement corruption was not part of it. In fact, corruption was very much, things got distributed and people were able to sort of bring their patronage and sort of capture some of the assets in each of the ministries and areas that they had. By the time the people started really protesting about corruption, and the international community and some of the others got to thinking about corruption, politicians' stakes in the illicit wealth, and so we're talking wealth acquired through privatization, exploitation of privatization after the war, capture of state assets, ties with criminal groups, patronage, clientelism, all of that made it much more difficult to progress forward. So Bosnia is one of the poorest countries in Europe. Nationalist tensions still remain high. The rate of recruitment to jihadi organizations, I've heard some people say it's amongst the highest in the world. And there has been recently in the last years a lot of popular protests, but it's very difficult for that to get traction in the face of some of these vested interests. And it's still very, very difficult to change. I'd add, for even worse, so not addressing corruption at all can really, I think, lock one into a negative piece. Even if you're not saying, okay, I'm not going to address corruption, I'm going to focus on peace building. Some of these sort of common peace building kinds of approaches, if they're corruption blind, in other words, don't think about how corruption might affect what happens, can actually make the corruption problem worse and further entrench it. I think many of us have seen all sorts of studies about what the influx of international aid does in a lot of conflict contexts to distort the economy, providing incentives and opportunities for corruption to grow. Afghanistan, we heard about tens of billions of dollars, flawed oversight and contracting because there were just not enough people to really manage it well, partnering with power brokers who had connections to illicit actors or who engaged in them themselves. That not only worsened the corruption problem, but also drove people to the Taliban. I'll just give a couple of examples from sort of some other standard kinds of approaches in the peace building repertoire, so to speak. Security sector reform, where you focus on sort of reforming the military, police, and to make it more democratic, more inclusive, more responsive to citizens' need and less oppressive. A lot of the reform programs focus on what they call train and equip. Equipment, technical training, infrastructure, et cetera. But if the programming, and it's been found to do that, ignores the role of corruption in the whole institution, hiring and promotion and task allocation are dictated by loyalty-based obligations, for example. That often includes sharing of financial flows from lower to higher, from bribes and all that type of thing. Or that police or justice officials are regularly bribed by people to carry out false arrests and to pressure their adversaries. If you ignore all of that is happening, you can imagine the results. The equipment and the funds that they get allow them to do what they were doing even better. And that's what we found in our own research in Central African Republic, and Transparency International has found something similar in Mali. Decentralization and power sharing, also another sort of peace-building response to try to provide sort of greater autonomy and greater voice and greater ability for people to sort of have control over their own affairs in intergroup conflict situations. But some of this in Kosovo, for example, they've done a study looking at Kosovo had it sort of decentralized to the municipal level, partly to give Serb minorities in Kosovo some opportunity to control their own municipalities, but also to induce greater acceptance to the Kosovar institutions. But as no one had integrated any accountability dimension into the whole municipal decentralization and a municipal support programming, within 5 years, all mayors were beholden to the nationalist political parties, and we're talking Albanian mayors mostly, but also Serbian into Serbia. They did their bidding. Municipal governments were staffed by political party clients and patrons, and municipal service provision remained weak. Unemployment still high, and and more of a cooperation between ethnic groups stagnated. So it had some negative side effects. And so really thinking through sort of how does peace building, can we be just like we want development and humanitarian assistance to be more conflict sensitive? Can peace building be more corruption sensitive and therefore more effective and more able to actually start to bridge from that negative peace to a more positive peace dynamic? So we're stuck with the dilemma. So the short term is it's difficult to address corruption, at least directly. And as people say, you can't ignore the power, I mean, you really can't ignore the power balance and elite interests. So I am being realistic. But in the long term, if you allow this to happen, it undermines any potential to move towards positive peace. And that is a concern that is valid, as we said before, because anti-corruption is fundamentally challenging power, and it fundamentally can destabilize. Unfortunately, anti-corruption practice, you can say, okay, well, we should be concerned with corruption. Let's hand it to the anti-corruption field. And anti-corruption practice, as we have now found out painfully, itself has not provided very helpful answers, at least until very recently. There's a lot more engagement recently. It has been highly conflict insensitive, and in fact, has fueled conflict in a number of ways. And I'm not going to go into many of them. We can talk about them in the question period. I'll just give you a couple of stories. One is from my experience in Kosovo and southern Serbia. I was working with an NGO running a big aid program for infrastructure development in southern Serbia, which is it's an area that has a very large Albanian population just across the border from Kosovo. So they decided they're going to adopt a best practices in procurement. So they did all the things correctly according to what the manual says is something that prevents corruption, allows for fair competition, etc. The result? Only Serb companies got contracts in an area that has a majority Albanian population. And actually, even those companies came from the capital very far away. So there was very little even local sort of benefit to local companies and people. How did that happen? A lot of the people in the area couldn't fulfill the requirements. Or there were conditions that made it very difficult for them to do things like register like the way they had to do that. And so this was inadvertent, but it ended up actually heightening tensions in that area for a while. Investigations focused on a sector. Again, sort of, you might say, all right, we're going to focus on government corruption, or we're going to focus on corruption in the justice sector or the education sector. And sometimes, if you're not careful about sort of how that overlaps with conflict divides, that too can exacerbate tensions. South Africa, where I'm now working a lot more, corruption and the focus of a lot of both the focus of corruption, but anti-corruption is on the public sector, which is largely controlled by Blacks. The largely white-dominated private sector is not so scrutinized. And so in this context, the imbalance and inattention to the private sector, which is not exactly uncorrupt itself, is seen as unjustly benefiting whites and penalizing Blacks. And it also reinforces racial stereotypes. So not something very constructive. So I will come to a conclusion and hopefully get questions and ideas from all of you. So what do you do about this? And I think we're at a point, I think, in this field where we actually are just starting to experiment with some new ideas and start to think about this. One is to start thinking on the peace building side. Can we find ways of addressing corruption in the early post-violence stage? And it's not an all or nothing thing necessarily. Can we start laying some of the foundation so that it doesn't become difficult and so entrenched later on? And can we start to consider and mitigate corruption impacts of peace-building interventions? I mean, even if we're not engaging in anti-corruption programming. And as we are working with the anti-corruption field, there's a great need because many of the anti-corruption approaches are, I think somebody called it to me the other day, the bad guy approach. You investigate, you prosecute, you shame, you do investigative, you really sort of attack. they're very adversarial. Can we start thinking about different approaches that are less adversarial, less confrontational, um, of thinking about sort of promoting and dealing with corruption? And can we help anti-corruption folks pay attention to the impacts on conflict and politics? And so more broadly, again, I think people are starting to experiment with this now, but I can think in peacemaking processes, in sort of negotiation processes, anti-corruption is integrated into peace agreements, and it's not a panacea. And we can put the study for that in chat. It's not clear how effective that is, but it certainly does provide kind of a hook and a foundation or a focal point for mobilization of resources, for mobilization of civil society and other parties who may want to actually do something. It provides some legitimacy for that. Same thing on sort of having more inclusive processes. The more other parties, and it's not just between the armed groups and the power brokers. I mean, I have no illusions that the balance of power amongst armed groups is critical to take into account. But the more others are included, the more likely some of these other issues are likely to get on the agenda and likely to be followed up. And finally, somebody has talked about what they call doorstep conditions in peace processes. We tend to think of anti-corruption as sort of all or nothing. We have, zero tolerance for corruption. And that's both unrealistic and unwise. And so are there things that we can do now? Are there some issues that we can start to tackle now because they're more feasible to tackle? Are there groups to strengthen now so that they have the capacity and they have some alliances to be able to play a role later? And so really thinking about how in the early stages in the peace processes, can we do things to set up conditions that allow people to tackle corruption more? The other, I think two things really is actually two things, I guess. One is really thinking about in peace building practice, can we start looking at cross-sector and cross-level coalitions. Corruption theoretically should be an issue, could be an issue that is something that generates common interest. And we've seen a bunch of ways where it doesn't necessarily. I mean, it could certainly be manipulated, but one can start engaging in some of the dialogue work and the problem-solving work and bringing people together across these conflict divides to really think about how to deal with that together. And I think that's something that the peace building field could contribute really quite powerfully into the anti-corruption space. Commissions like the Commission on Impunity, thinking about dealing with corruption, at least some of the past corruption and current corruption in a transitional justice process. It's not easy, but the Guatemalan Commission on Impunity, it did actually had a huge amount of success and generated a lot of public support in investigating. They had a mandate to investigate sort of like the ties of government with some of these criminal groups and the corruption because it was actually generating a lot of violence there. They got a lot of resistance. They were eventually disbanded, and the new president is still getting a lot of pushback and a lot of resistance and sort of interference and et cetera. But it's something that can be considered. I think the final thing is to say, how do we think as international actors, how we contribute, and can we close off the international enablers? And that's partly thinking about how we give aid, but all of these sort of siphoning off of funds doesn't happen without lawyers and bankers and real estate brokers, et cetera, who can manage the money as it goes out of a country. And there's been a lot more focus on that in the anti-corruption field now. Again, it's not going to solve the problem, but it can certainly make it less easy to continue to do this. And so I think I'm going to stop there and take questions and ideas for you. As I said, this is a pretty new it's a new area that we were just talking about. So I think there's lots of room for creativity and sort of piloting new approaches.
Oh, well, Diana, that it's mind-boggling what you've uncovered here. And I mean, the sort of subterranean nature of it too, and making it difficult to access in a way that, you know, you could approach other, you know, political issues, say, for example. This is really, wow, you have really uncovered something powerful, and I'm just so impressed with everything you and your group have done. Let me get started with some of the questions. Roger Johnson says, is what we are seeing just in the last few days regarding Trump's crypto exchange, Musk's efforts at establishing a Bitcoin world, and Zuckerberg's desire to establish his own brand of crypto as a new kind of money, and he thinks will increase his wealth? Are these examples of corruption renewed right here in the United States?
Um, I am really worried about what's
Yeah.
happening in the United States. And it's not just that, Roger, though I think that's true. You know, as President Biden is outgoing saying there's an oligarchy. I mean, we are looking more like what the Zondo Commission was describing in South Africa on a day-to-day basis. And I mean, I have to say I'm on the various listservs for the anti-corruption field, and it's very depressing. They've fired oversight agencies, they're closing down oversight agencies. They've now withdrawn protection for national security whistleblowers. So a lot of these types of things that are supposed to actually encourage and sort of provide some guardrails are going away. And just like the conflict of interest, I mean, I can get so many things, but we have traditionally not been thought of as a country of endemic corruption, although it's a good example of where corruption is not illegal. But it still might be considered corruption, some of the sort of influence. But I think we're in danger of really moving in that direction. It does worry me a lot.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from someone from Colombia about generating guarantees for armed groups versus resocializing them. And is this, would you, in your mind, a sort of an incentive for corruption, for continuing corruption?
I mean, and I'm not sure what sort of the guarantees are. You know, I think one needs to balance some of these things, but also think about, you know, what and understand, you know, again, what is the function that corruption and crime plays? And there's a sort of a greed piece of it, but often there are other kinds of functions. So I think one could think about resocializing people, but and guarantees, but really think about how do we then address some of the underlying conditions for that would lead them to engage in corruption. And I think one of the problems that we found in the anti-corruption as we look at is there tends to be, and today actually the Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International is coming out. There tends to be a lot of measuring corruption, how much perceptions of corruption is there, and much less of why does it exist? What are the kinds of drivers that it exists? And it's very difficult to actually sort of do something about it if you actually don't know what it's driving it. And what's driving it is not always greed. So it's complex. So I think some analysis and thinking of that might help think through some of these issues. I know that's not super specific.
Listen, it's hard to be specific
Yeah.
with the complexity that you're dealing here with corruption. That was Laura Herrera, by the way, from Colombia, and Sylvia McShane's asking you, are there any models of good practice in peace building that may encourage us in these challenging times?
Yeah. We're all depressed.
Good luck, Diana, with
I
that.
know. Good luck on that one. You know, I recently have been working with some Ukrainians, and I'm looking at the corruption and sort of the lots of internal corruption, lots of corruption in Ukraine, but also lots of internal tensions, you know, beyond obviously the Ukrainian-Russian war. And they were describing to me some really interesting work that they have done with municipalities on really bringing stakeholders together to really talk together about some of the problems that they're faced at a local level. Now, the local level isn't going to solve the national level, but they've really had both on the corruption and sort of the governance and sort of services and in bringing people together at the same time, they've had some tremendous success with some of the models there. And that was really, I have to say, that was for me was really encouraging to see some of these kind of peace building, what we've known in conflict resolution being used to start addressing some of these other issues in conflict environments really successfully.
So it's like dialogue processes?
Dialogue and multi-stakeholder problem solving,
Multi-stakeholder,
joint analysis, and so where people are getting to know each other, but they're doing both at the same time because they're having to deal with some of the other underlying tensions, between veterans and the populations, between different ethnicities in some of these municipalities. So they're integrating it a lot more. And so I think generating also a sense, at least within the municipality, of some sort of social cohesion while they're also addressing some of the real problems. And
well, that sounds promising. Miguel Santos is asking, many nations caught in cycles of corruption and violence have deeply entrenched elite networks that benefit from instability. What negotiation strategies have proven most effective in persuading corrupt power structures to relinquish control and pave the way for sustainable peace?
oh, big question. I think we don't know. And I'd certainly, I mean, if one thinks that and I think you've caught the sort of cycle, is that the entrenchment of these elite networks that benefit from instability, they also benefit from the corruption. And so it goes hand in hand. And so I think one of the challenges, I think we don't actually know, though I think challenging our assumptions. I'm teaching a course with the U4. It's a think tank on anti-corruption, and these are mostly people who are working in conflict-affected areas. And I have a police advisor who's in Kosovo, who just negotiated. They're trying to deal with organized crime in the north of Kosovo, in the Serbia, right at the border, which has been not subjected. They have resisted Kosovar sort of authority, and it has been kind of a lawless place because of the contesting. And so he actually went to the head of security in Serbia and said, look, because they were promoting instability because they thought it would benefit them and benefit sort of the resistant to Albanian rule in that area. And he said, what you're doing is you're actually sort of hurting your own people here. I mean, here's what's happening on the drug, et cetera. And he actually got him to cooperate. And they worked together to actually close down some of these criminal networks. I thought, oh, that was a kind of out of the box thinking. One would not, because of these connections, one wouldn't necessarily automatically think of doing that. But he did, and it worked.
Wow, that's great. A question from Suzanne Geis. She's a presenter here last year at the Kelman seminar. Suzanne is asking, do you have any comment on what's been called legal corruption in the US? That is the power of money in the political system, contributions to dark money, political groups, et cetera. Is that corruption in your mind? And do you see it as a source of conflict?
The short answer is yes. Yeah, I think we, all these debates about corruption, and it is. I mean, the debates about corruption, actually the UN Convention Against Corruption actually doesn't have a definition of corruption because they couldn't agree on a definition. So it's really difficult to define. So we tend to default to sort of the what's illegal is what gets defined as corruption. And I think we miss a lot of these things, Suzanne, and these are, it's an exhibit of a certain kind of sort of political money. Some of the dark money is one syndrome of corruption. It's different than sort of the oligarchs stealing, and controlling the state and patronage. But it still has, I think, equally equally negative effects. And certainly in a case where it's really being used to divide and to sort of promote inequality, has definitely the capacity to be a source of conflict.
All right, thank you. Roger Johnson has an interesting question about, is corruption a very natural outgrowth of the very nature of the human species? After 2 million years of evolution, wherein the search for food and desire for survival of our species has built into our genes a selfish and aim toward personal benefit that today can manifest itself as governmental corruption by a nation's leaders.
Oh, that's very profound.
Isn't it?
Corruption has existed. If anybody read Sarah Chase's book on corruption in America. It came out a few years ago, but she starts way back, sort of in way before ancient Greece, and sort of tracks corruption. So it has been around for a very long time. I think that sort of context, people do want to survive, and there are certain kinds of, and I think that as in conflict, there are certain kinds of basic needs that people have, and if that's what they feel like they need to survive, they will go after it. And so I think the context, you can not pursue your own personal benefit if you feel that you can get your needs met. If there is a way of actually having sort of a fair resolution of your disputes and having a fair chance. I mean, I think some of these other things that we've talked about in terms of building institutions and building some of these things are designed to say, you're not just on your own doing this. This is not just a dog-eat-dog world. In Congo, there's a saying, there's a fictitious article, 15 of the Constitution. It's not an article of the Constitution, but Mobutu, when he so kind of, it was such a kleptocratic state that people said, look, you fend for yourself. If you're going to survive, you fend for yourself. And that's sort of become kind of the norm, is that it's okay to fend for yourself because there's nothing there to protect you. And so in that sense, yes, and I think there are ways that we can channel that in ways that aren't necessarily corrupt and sort of taking advantage of other people.
Okay, Diana, we have like a minute for this last question, and it's from our colleague Paula Gutlove, also grew up in this environment.
Hi,
Do you
Paula.
have any examples wherein bringing the international actors, for example, OSCE, UNHCR, et cetera, can help to deal with corruption in the peace building or post-peace building stage?
I mean, they are there in this peace building and peace building stage. And unfortunately, what I've seen is sometimes they contribute to the whole problem. And not just by bringing in a lot of aid, but, if the international actors themselves think, sextortion, for example, there's lots of sextortion in humanitarian aid, and there have been a number of scandals. And if a number of these things, if the international agencies don't have accountability and hold their own people accountable, how do they expect this to sort of be of assistance in some of these other societies? So I think they can. And I think there are, and there are some interesting, I mean, there are people doing some very interesting work. And so international actors can help. I think there's a caution that a lot of these things are highly contextual. And so I think we need to be careful about bringing in the models that we have about how government should work, what the separation of the public and private space is, what kinds of models work, sort of bring in the Western police model and sort of plant it. I think we need to be very careful about doing that because that tends not to work and it tends to distract. But I think if we are appropriately sort of in an accompaniment mode and really helping people and empowering some of these other local actors to be able to work on it themselves and bridging gaps, there's a lot that international actors could definitely do.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. And I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Nicole Bryant. But before, I just want to thank you, Diana. This was extraordinary. I mean, I've learned so much in this short period of time. And I'm so grateful that you and your colleagues are doing this work. So, and Nicole, over to you.
Absolutely. And I'm going to echo that. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Diana. A really illuminating conversation. And everyone, since I know that we're at time, I will just briefly say that we're back tomorrow. We have another event. Josh Weiss, affiliate faculty member at PON, is here to present his new book, Getting Back to the Table. And so we look forward to seeing you perhaps at 12 noon tomorrow. If you were unable to catch the beginning of this session, or if you're going to miss tomorrow, all of these events are recorded and on our website. So we hope to see you there. And a big thanks to the PON events team. Fun fact, we also have a faculty dinner tonight. So this is basically a 14-hour day for Diane and Lindsay and everyone. So many thanks to them for running such a great event. And thanks to everyone for joining us. All right, we hope to see you soon. Stay tuned and be well.